At the far north end of the planet Earth, there's a large sheet of ice floating atop the Arctic Ocean that grows and shrinks with the seasons. That's common knowledge today, but it was not always so. Before the advent of long range aircraft, satellites, and submarines, it would require a massive undertaking to do any study of it whatsoever. Ships could only get so close before the ice became a danger. Any further exploration had to be done across the ice on foot. This challenge led to waves of exploration to try to get to the North Pole, as the North Pole proved to be a perfect goal point. This video is focused specifically on one event in that progression, one specific attempt made by an already renowned explorer, which also proved by coincidence that the Arctic ice was a floating sheet carried across ocean currents. Fridtjof Nansen was born in 1861 in Norway. He grew to be a man of many talents. He's referred to commonly as a polymath due to his contributions across many fields of science and humanitarianism. He gained renown first for an expedition that he led across the Greenland interior, making him and his crew the first people to reach it. Not content to just be an explorer, his research on the nervous system of marine animals served as a foundation for the understanding of the neuron years later. But by then he had already developed another interest, oceanography. He led many scientific cruises in the North Atlantic and developed many tools and methods which proved fundamental to the field years later. This is all to say that Nansen was already a well-respected scientist and a revered explorer. All the more shocking, then, when he proposed a voyage which most people considered ludicrous at best and an illogical scheme of self-destruction at worst, intentionally freezing his vessel into the Arctic sea ice in an attempt to float to the North Pole. This idea was not entirely without merit. It was theorized that such a thing had been possible due to a nautical oddity in years prior. An American research ship, the Jeannette, had been trapped by and crushed in the polar ice off the coast of Siberia. 3 years later, wreckage and some items for the ship were found scattered on the Greenland shore. Somehow, these materials ended up halfway around the world in a completely different ocean. Therefore, it was theorized, the ice must have carried them there somehow, and perhaps that route crossed right over the North Pole. Despite this believable conjecture, it was still a risky and overall inadvisable decision to test with one's life, most people said, especially considering that the crew of the Jeannette were lost horribly in the cold. Nansen was determined, however, and started making preparations to test this theory. Nansen had a custom ship ordered, the Fram, which was specially reinforced to be able to ride safely encased in the ice. It needed to be small, yet capable of holding 5 years of supplies. It also had to be sturdy enough to withstand the sea ice the whole time, and as such was shaped specially. The Jeannette was crushed due to not quite being strong enough to withstand it. A crew of 12 Norwegians was assembled, and the Fram departed. After 18 months of being frozen in the ice, Nansen grew impatient. The ice movements were erratic and slow. He determined that they would not cross the pole after all, and so he ordained to make a trek over land by dog sled. By a stroke of luck, the ship's stoker, Hjalmar Johansen, was an expert dog sledder, and as such was selected to join him for this expedition. The two made a daring attempt, reaching an at the time world record of 86 degrees and 13.6 minutes north latitude, before having to turn the expedition around due to slowing progress and limited food supplies. This entire expedition, and the return journey as well, is a story within itself, with near-death encounters and polar bear attacks, but to summarize it in brief, the two braved the elements and returned to a small archipelago of solid land near modern-day Russia, known as Franz Josef Land. A sailor that Nansen had actually turned down for his crew, ironically enough, had made his own expedition to Franz Josef Land and stumbled across and recognized Nansen upon meeting him. He brought Nansen and Johansen back home to Norway. Nansen would go on to retire from exploration and served as a diplomat for much of the rest of his life, eventually earning the Nobel Peace Prize, and Johansen would continue his exploration career and eventually participate in a journey to the South Pole, saving lives along the way. The Fram, meanwhile, and her crew would continue in the ice and eventually would break free several years later and return home to Norway. This voyage not only broke the record for furthest north at the time, it also served as definitive proof of the current across the North Sea, and thus proved that it was a floating sheet of ice subject to ocean currents the same as any other floating object. Their exact movement across the ice was charted using astronomical data, and maps were even made of their exact path. It turned out that after Nansen's departure, the Fram actually got within 23 nautical miles of their final position. So they might have actually been better off waiting a little longer before departing for the North Pole, but there was no way for them to know such a thing. This is only barely scratching the surface of what happened on this expedition. Everything from the route that they took to the location of their camp to even the parties that the crew had on the boat are well documented. So I highly recommend checking the internet for more sources, as it's, again, very well documented.